Well, good morning. Happy New Year. First of all, thank you. Thanks, Dale. Thanks to Mark. Thanks for George. Thanks for United Potato Growers for having me back. So we have a lot to go through, and as we move forward here, I titled this, There's a Lot to Consider, and I think that's a fair way to start the year. There is a lot to consider, and several of our introduction early on have said, there is a lot of things happening. Yes, I don't think Canada will become the 51st state, but, weird things have happened. So let's get in and let's get started. So I'm going to start with sort of a bigger view about kind of agriculture, and then we'll get into macroeconomics. And if we have some time, we'll talk a little bit about what's happening in the markets itself, but I'll give you a little bit of view of that too anyway. So there's a lot of things we're thinking about, and this is more longer term, and think about what is it we should be thinking about, what should we be concerned about, and how should we plan our businesses going forward. Obviously, we're in a situation now in the markets where this is a supply-driven market. It's not a demand problem. I mean, you look at any crop or any row crop that you see, we're seeing record demand. So this is not a demand problem, this is a supply problem. We have just too much stuff. Obviously, weather's continue to be a back of mind. My daughter lives in Glendale, California, which is just on the other side of the mountain from Pasadena, so we're worried about Santa Ana winds this week there, to say the least. They are packed up and ready to evacuate if they have to, unfortunately. We've talked about this in the past, but government intervention becomes a bigger and bigger issue for all of us in agriculture. And that's not just our business, but all of businesses. And so I think you have to, and we'll come back to trade and tariffs and protectionism in a minute. But, you think about the geopolitical upheaval. Think about all the countries that had elections in 24, and they threw incumbents out. They threw the incumbent governments out, and we're going to start over. That happened here in the United States. It's happening in Canada right now. Mexico was one exception here in North America. So that's upheaval. The climate change movement is still going on, and I think we all have to think about that and think about in the context, and this is one of the things we're trying to talk about as a research group, is it's about climate change, but it's also what do we do to make our business more sustainable economically, and how do we make it cost less? And so these are all things that we're coming together. Biofuels are not going anywhere, and I'll come back to that a little bit later as well. This also goes into changes on the farm. You think about the cost that produces, whether it's potatoes, whether it's corn, soybeans, wheat, barley, whatever, the cost is going up. What do we do? How do we change the farm to become more efficient? What are the technologies we adapt? What do we do? And I think that's one of our big things we're talking about as a group. And I will tell you, it comes a little bit out of, and I'll pull the curtain back a little bit, of the Europeans, as we're a European bank, climate change, they're all about sustainability and climate change. And we've pushed back on that some. But as we've pushed back on that to the Europeans, we've talked to the discussion and said, this is about cost. We have to look at the economics of this. What is the trade-offs? What are we going to do about that? Then the last two things. We've had a lot of discussions, a lot of questions from producers about, commoditization, specialty, or diversification. And when you think about, as Dale said, I'm from Iowa. We plant 4 crops in Iowa: corn, soybeans. That's all we do. And so how do we diversify that? How do we get a specialty crop? And we had this discussion 3 years ago when prices were really high, and said, this is when you ought to be thinking about it, because you can stomach a little challenge. Well, now you don't have the resources to stomach maybe a tough year because you made a change. And so, but this is something we think people need to think about, particularly when easy is about rotation and double cropping. And finally, population. For how many people in the room over the last several years have said, we got to feed 10 billion people by 2050, we got to do that, and we've heard that mantra, and agriculture's have been done that, and I see lots of nodding heads. Let me challenge that a little bit. We have always produced enough food to feed everybody in the world on the aggregate. And I think farmers, for 2 reasons. One, the price incentive will always be there if that's the demand. Also, farmers have a calling. You have a calling to produce food to feed people. And you're producing enough food to feed more people every year. The problem usually is politics, logistics, and distribution, and price. But let's think about this differently. Last year, China was the first time it had population decrease. Now that sent shivers up my spine. and to think about what happens, and we were talking there last night, and remind me a couple slides I forgot to put in. But if you look at birth rates around the world, they're going down. And you also see birth rates now are not exceeding people who are dying. So wonder if we have less people and we have this huge production capacity build up in agriculture, how is that going to work? And I would tell you, I'm more concerned about that than I am the fact that we're going to not be able to feed, whether it's 10 billion people or 9 billion people by 2050. Okay. We have to talk about this. This is a little bit of a delicate, and I'll just do a full disclosure. I'm a homeless Republican. And so let's talk about what this new administration is going to do and where we're going to go. And the first question that we always get is about tariffs. And I can't tell you, if it's not the first question when we talk to producers and agribusiness, it's at least the second question. They're going to disrupt trade. That's just going to be the reality we're in. And I'll show you a little bit more kind of detail and talk about soybeans too. But I think we have to look at this in a couple different ways. And he did double down last week when the Washington Post came out and said, you know, there's been some moderation within the new administration, and Mr. Trump came back and said, nope, that's not true. We're still going to do what I talked about on the campaign trail. So there's that piece. I think the other piece we have to remember is that Mr. Trump prides himself as a negotiator and a deal maker, and he always has talked about, and he's one of those negotiators as an old purchasing person. He throws the bomb in the room and sees what happens, what scatters, and how do people react to it. So I think you have a little bit of that as he wants to get people to react to see what they think and where he can go from there. But at the same time, he's also talked about surgically placing tariffs in different places of the world. But the difference from what we had in 18 versus today is it does seem like it's a little more broader based. And so, you know, for agriculture, we benefit from freer trade and we benefit from not having restrictions on that trade. So this is a part that's really dear to our hearts. So we have to make sure that, you know, our members of Congress understand what this means to us. And I think there'll be a lot of discussion about where does the president's power stop and where does it begin when we think about tariffs, particularly when we think about blanket tariffs. So this is going to be a topic that's going to go on. I will say one thing, we don't think this will be a big issue until the latter half of this year. He has a lot on his plate that he wants to get done up front, so we need to talk about that. Deregulation. You know, who in the room is against deregulation? Boy, it's really quiet this morning. So, you know, what politicians ever run against, I'm going to make more regulation, because that's not what the voter wants. But let's think about that for a minute. If you deregulate, there's unintended consequences of that. And we have a good example today. We buried President Carter, or have the National Memorial for him at the National Cathedral, and he deregulated the airline industry. And that democratized, I can't get the word out this morning, you know, the airlines, so we could all fly better. But think about what happened is, we're now down to basically 4 airlines that we can all pick from. And so there's unintended consequences to regulation. And one of the things that I talk about with people is that it's not necessarily that the regulation is bad, it's the process to get there. What can we do to make that process of regulation, permitting is a good example, making it better for all of us and easier to get through? Whether it's government, whether state, local, or federal, what can we do to make it work better for us? Biofuels are not going away, but they're just not going to have the tailwind they've had before. It's going to be very difficult, I think, for biofuels to just go away as I think some people would like. But at the same time, he's talked about drill, baby, drill. And when we talked to our energy analysts about this, he said the issue is not about we need more energy. And a good example happened just this week. They had a lease auction in Alaska for drilling, and they didn't have one taker. So we have plenty of oil, and the oil companies have been very disciplined and not going out with higher prices and doing that. So I think the energy industry will be interesting to watch, and it's not exactly what we think. Immigration is a huge issue. It's been a consistent issue for President-elect Trump since 2015 and even beyond that. And so we know in agriculture that that's a really important issue for us because we need that labor. It's very difficult, and I've had farmers say, you know, we hire people from town and they come out for 3 or 4 days and they never come back. You know, immigrant labor is really important, and particularly when you think about your industry, you think about the livestock industry, particularly dairy particularly dairy and swine, you need that labor. And so I think this is something also that people need to understand. It does appear that there is some education going on, and there seems to be some more moderation in this as far as the fact that we need that labor. In our view, inflation and interest rates are not really going to, and I'll talk more about that later, are really not going to go very far. Because you look at the policies of tariffs, you look at spending goals, you look at the deportation policy, if that works, and I think there's a question about that in tax policy. These are inflationary type policies. You're putting more money back in the economy, and so that's going to inflate, it's more money chasing fewer goods and services. And so that's going to inflate the economy. And so I think we're concerned about that. And if the Fed sees more inflation, they're going to keep interest rates a little bit higher than we typically see. Lastly, a couple things. RFK Jr. to me is a wild card, and what we've talked about is a wild card to food and agriculture. That's really going to be something we have to think about, and we have to be very on top of all the time. Now, the nominee for Secretary of Agriculture, Brooke Rollins, she has had some agricultural background, but she doesn't know really us in agriculture, and we don't know her very well. And when you talk to folks in Washington, they don't know her as well. Now, the president knows her very well, and she has the president's cell phone number so she can call him. So that's a good thing for us. But there's going to be, again, a lot of education and socialization to have us all work together. So that's sort of some really quick overviews of impacts within agriculture. Let me talk more about tariffs. So let me kind of walk this through you. Life has changed since 18. So this is soybean exports to China from the United States. And you can see what happened in 18 and 19, and I don't need to go through that history. But you can see since then we've had a lot of changes, a lot of ups and downs in soybean exports to China from the United States. We've had some good years and we've had some not so good years. But the whole environment has changed from 18, which is really surprising when you think about it. Brazil continues to produce more and more soybeans, and so the Chinese don't necessarily have to have two suppliers. They can go to Brazil and get everything they want. China also has changed as well. They got ready for the tariffs because they're worried. So they have stocked up and have record stocks of corn, wheat, and soybeans on hand. So they're ready where they weren't back in 18. The other thing is that the Chinese, too, their economy is much different. And I'll show that a little bit later. The economy is different in China. They are not growing like they did before. And so they have a lot more to lose in a tariff war than they had even, the few short years ago in 18. So the whole system has changed, the whole dynamics within the market's changed. So but we have to be aware of that and keep track of that and think about that. So difference. I just want to mention a couple things here. I'm not going to go through all of this, but we get a lot of questions about, and it's a fair question, and this is a question that comes both out of Canada and the United States. Where are the new trade opportunities? How do we compete in the global market? Because we're not the cheapest producer in the world anymore. But where are the new opportunities? Let's put China aside for the moment. Everyone focuses on China. It's like the Walmart of the world. But it's also about where are the new opportunities? Southeast Asia and India I've talked about before, but specifically Vietnam. And Vietnam will probably be very important, particularly if we see a gray channel develop for U.S. exports into China. They will probably go through Vietnam. The other big place is the EU. The EU is, with their climate change regulation, less use of fertilizer. And in the Netherlands, they're trying to buy out dairy farms because the nitrogen emissions are so high there. So just less production. And if you look across a number of different crops, canola, a really interesting one, or rapeseed, however you want to describe it. Europe is a big producer of that, but they're also a huge importer. And so we think that Europe will become a bigger and bigger importer is an opportunity for us as well. And so I just want to kind of leave you with that is it's not all gloom and doom there, but we have to be very specific about how we would do this and make sure our logistics and our systems are in place to service this. Okay. One last thing, and then we'll get to macroeconomics. We get a lot of questions about where are we in the cycle? And you can see where we've been. We've certainly, in the John Deere's in the room, and we know what's happened to the machinery companies. They have pulled, they have laid off a lot of people. They're just not selling much machinery. And so you see producers now in that cycle are coming down and so on. Well, okay, I'll use a little less fertilizer. Maybe I won't use that fungicide at the end of, into the growing season. All those sorts of things that you would expect to happen. And so we're getting down near the bottom of that cycle. Now, that doesn't mean the cycle is over. It just means we're near the bottom of that cycle. So we're starting to see land values pull back a little bit. We're starting to see land rents renegotiated. So we're in the bottom of that cycle, and it'd be interesting this year as we go through renewals, what balance sheets look like. And I would argue, I know there's a couple bankers in the room, I would probably say to you that they're not going to look as good as they've looked over the last couple, 3-4 years. But the question then is, when do we get out of this? And you'll notice we used to have 26 and 27 at the end of that cycle, and we've taken them out because we're not sure. When we look at crop budgets, we do see potentials. We get into 26 to maybe some break evens. Now that's on basic corn, soybeans, and wheat. And so we use those as barometers as bringing stuff up. But it's going to be, we're in that cycle. And remember, we had the same cycle from 14 to 20. So we'll have to wait and see, but we're kind of near the bottom of it, and we're going to be here just for a little bit until we get get these costs down and get things lined up. But I wanted to at least show that to you and tell you what we're thinking about. Okay, last slide. We don't see a lot of change in acreage. Corn acres, 90 million or so. This is out of our 10-year baseline. Soybean acres stay a little bit elevated here because of the new crushing capacity coming on. And then as some of that crushing capacity gets rationalized, we start to see soybean acres come off. You see cotton pretty flat. We see wheat relatively flat and declining as we get to the back end of that 5 years. Okay, let's talk about macroeconomics. I mentioned China, and you can see the red line in there is China. And you can see this is from the IMF, you can see a lot of volatility, but as we go forward, we don't see a lot of change from where we are today going forward. And you can see that China is continuing to go down. Now, there were some people who will tell you, China says officially it's a 4 to 5% growth per year. If you talk to people in China and kind of dig into the numbers that you can dig in, people say it's closer to 1%. So they're even below where we are. And so you have to be conscious of what's happening around the world. Europe is in a tough spot. They are not making much progress either. Canada has had its issues as well, and we'll talk a little bit about currencies too, but you can see the economic growth around the world is not great. And so we're entering a time of a lot of uncertainty. And as I mentioned up front, we had a lot of changes in governments over the last year, and we're in the process of that as well. And with that brings a lot of uncertainty in what happens next. But if we look at the U.S., and I'll use Christian Lawrence as one of our macroeconomists, and I'll quote him a couple times, we're the cleanest shirt in the dirty laundry. We're still running 2.5 to 3% GDP per year, and it looks like that's going to continue to be the case. As I said earlier, the farm economy is not great. It is not good at all. But you look at the general economy of the United States, it's actually performing on all cylinders right now, if I can use that term now. You see an economy that's almost perfect. And the question you always have as an economist, and we're taught this to always look for the outlier, what changes it doesn't make it good any better? How do you make perfect better? But you can see we have really good growth since COVID, and that continues to be the expectation is that 2025 will be a pretty good year for the U.S. economy going forward. I show these maps not because I have a lot of comments, but I think it was very interesting. I want you to focus primarily on the map on the right. So this comes out of the St. Louis Fed. It's called FRED, Federal Reserve Economic Data. You can even buy t-shirts now. There was an article about it in the New York Times. It was as an economist, we're pretty nerdy and we like these sort of things. But when you look at the map on the right, it was very interesting and somewhat disturbing as well. So these are every county in the United States. If it's a green county, the GDP went up. If it's a red county, that means it's gone down. I'll point to my home state of Iowa. Northwest Iowa was pretty much all red, and that's very, very rural area. And you can find your counties and where you are in the United States. But you can see the rural counties are just not growing. There's a few that are, but it does, to me, there's a couple things to think about. What do we do to change this picture? What do we do to change government? What do we need to do to make government more functional in rural America? What do we do to increase the industrial base? What do we do to increase the job base? What do we do to increase the attraction for people to live in rural America? But it's a really interesting chart, and in some ways, also kind of mirrors where our political system is right now and how we're so on a rural-urban divide. But something to think about as you go home, how do we make our rural economies more interesting for everyone to participate in and grow? Interest rates. Every farmer wants to talk about interest rates, and everyone wants to say, what are they going to do today? So when we officially, as the bank, we think there'll be about 125-point interest rate cut in 2025. And that was what Christian said this earlier this week, earlier this week, talked about that. So we don't see a lot of change in interest rates where they are. And I talked earlier about economic growth. You know, the Fed wants to keep economic growth, but it doesn't want to get it out of hand because then you get an issue with inflation, and we'll come to inflation in a minute. So you can see where the federal funds rate is. If you look at the dot plot, the infamous dot plot, the Fed, when you look at that, the Board of Governors are thinking maybe there's 2 25 basis point cuts in 2025. So not a lot of change from where we are today. And as the chairman said during their last press conference in December, you know, they're still studying what the new administration's policies mean to the economy and how they're going to react to it. I don't think they know that yet. They're still trying to figure it out. At least they're not publicly saying that. So I don't think that you'll see a lot of changes in interest rates as we go into 2025. May see a little bit, but it's certainly not going to be what everyone would hope and what everyone would think that we should go to. So we'll stop there. One thing I do want to say is these are the yield curves, and people talk about these yield curves. Well, they're negative, so that pretends that a recession's on the way. Look at them now; they're all positive again. And so you think, well, we've either dodged the bullet or something's gone wrong. But you again think about the growth in the economy; it continues to be very good. And now as the yield curves have changed, it's like, okay, we're probably not going to have a recession. Not saying that we won't have one, but it does. Some of the data tells you that, you know, we're in better shape than we were a couple years ago. Let's talk about the dollar. So this is the dollar index, and I don't want to focus too much on this, but to show you what it is, because in some ways it's important to agriculture, but it's not critical to agriculture because the basket of the currencies that makes this are not necessarily the ones that we trade with or were important to us from an export perspective. But I do want to show you these 4 currencies. So we're looking at the real, the yen, the Canadian dollar, and the euro. Now I know I do the same thing. You can get your brain turned around currencies and go, oh, it's going up. Well, does that mean it's appreciating, depreciating? So if it's going up, that means it's depreciating against the US dollar. So let's think about this from a buyer perspective. And this is true across many currencies. And you think about the euro in particular, you know, they're buying our goods, it's costing them more money. And that's because the US dollar is so strong and because our economy is so strong as well, particularly when you look at the rest of the world. And the investors in the world go, where do I want to put my money? I want to put it someplace that's economically stable, that has growth opportunities, and is basically politically stable. And Brazil's had its issues. And so that's sort of the good news if you're traveling overseas. But the bad news on the real is those farmers are getting more reals per kilogram or per metric ton of soybeans or whatever they're going to ship out, orange juice or sugar or whatever. And so they're going to continue. That's incentive for them to produce. You look at the euro, it's going to cost them more money to buy our goods. So this is where the challenge is. How do we change this? And the challenge is if you change the dollar and lower the value of the dollar, it's usually because something didn't go well. And so it's a yin and yang sort of thing. Do you want a cheaper dollar? Yes, because it's better for exports, but that means something maybe in the economy is not going as well. So it's a very delicate balancing act that we are right now, that we're in. Let's talk about inflation. This is really the big challenge when we think about it. So you look at inflation's come down. On the left-hand side is the CPI. So you're looking at CPI and also CPI minus the volatile food and energy category. And you see it's come down. We're under 3% now. And a lot of people are going, phew, we're back to normal. But how many go to the grocery store and go, yeah, my grocery bill has gone down a lot? I don't see any hands. And that's the insidious thing about inflation, is that you see it and you watch it in the things that you buy, but it doesn't ever really go down. Now, you go, well, I'd really like it to go down. Let me just say Japan and deflation and how that worked out for them, not very well. So it's a very delicate balance of how we deal with this and how the Fed deals with it and where we're going from here. It has come down, and we've seen, when you think about the inflation numbers, it's the rate of growth of inflation. It's not the actual, it's that change. That's what we're looking at. That's what the headline number is. On the left-hand side is the services inflation. It's nearly still 5%. And I think about some of the services I buy. I think also about my property taxes. I think about my insurance. And I know that's a big issue for farmers as well. Think about your insurance for your farm. Whether it's your homeowner's insurance, whether it's your all farm insurance, it's not going down. And so services is still a very big inflation contributor. And the Fed has very little power to control that because they're not a capital intensive industry. So that's going to be a very difficult inflation number to get down farther as we go. It has come down, that's the good news, but it's still at a very relatively high level from what it has been in the past. Here's the services line. I'm sorry, I got messed up. So the one on the left-hand side, the right-hand side chart is the PCE, which is the Fed's favorite number. It has come down, but not quite to their 2%. So, okay, here's the service inflation. You can see, we have to go back a lot of years to see at these levels. But the Fed can't affect this very much, and this is going to be an issue going forward. Here's the thing that's also a bit of a baffling to me. Now, this is the economist speaking, and so we look at the data and we think about this. We think about where the consumer is. The consumer says, I can't afford my groceries, I can't afford my gasoline because I'm not keeping up with inflation, my earnings. But when you look at the data, the earnings inflation is still greater than the underlying CPI inflation. And this has continued to be a pretty consistent trend, which is really surprising. When I ran this for this meeting, I thought, well, this will change from what I've looked at in the past. And it's still really, really good from the standpoint from the individual waiver. And you can see unions have been able to get fairly significant raises, and we'll get a longshoreman's strike on the horizon. It's now, they've got a 63% increase in their wages, but they're worried about automation. So you can see we're still in a situation of inflation being a little bit supported because of what's happening on the wage side, and that's really important. I'm going to talk about the consumer and employment here kind of together because they do fit together. The good news, when we look at personal disposable income, it's still going up. We have still more money in our pocket than we had a year ago, and that talks about how we continue to spend money and the consumer continues to support the economy. That's amazing to me that the consumer hasn't backed off, and I'll show you that in a minute why I think that. And part of it is because of the unemployment rate. Yes, it's starting to tick up a little bit, and I'll show you why. But the fact is that if you want a job, for the most part, you can still find one. And so unemployment is historically very, very low. And then if we go to the next one and look at where job growth is, job growth in monthly, this is the headline number you see every month, we're still producing 200,000 jobs a month. That is absolutely amazing. The rest of the world is astounded at the ability that we get to do that. So that's a good thing for us. But here's the thing that's getting a little more concerning. So the red line is the number of job openings, the blue line is the number of people looking for jobs. You can see that number has been pretty wide, pretty big spread until now, and you're starting to see that spread come in, where you're almost, for every one person looking for a job, there's only one job out there. It's still about 1.5 at this point, just to give you a reference point. But the fact is that number is coming down, and as we've seen, companies lay off people. It hasn't been massive layoffs, but you see 50, you see 200 people here and there. And so you're starting to see that economy get a little bit tighter for the consumer, and they're a little bit more worried about their job. And so I think that's a caution that we have to think about as we come down through 25. If something changes in the economy, as I said, a perfect economy, what does that do to the job market? And you can see we're in a little bit tighter situation in which we have been for really now about 5 years. But the consumer is showing that stress. And I'm mixing the consumer employment together. Look at their credit card debt. Is it all-time record highs? And it's like, and even Christmas was a good shopping season for Christmas. But the consumer has a lot of debt. But then and then also the other thing that's happened, so this is the conference board. So this is looking at what the conference board is showing for the consumer. In November, that consumer confidence went up. Consumers, yep, everything's good, everything's going to be great. It got to December, and that number pulled right back to where it started back in early December. So the consumer has started to pull back a little bit and go, I'm not as confident as I was before. So let's, again, it goes back to what's happening in employment. It's also they're probably now opening those credit card bills from December and November and thinking, oh boy, I've got something I have to deal with here. You look at the personal savings rate, it's back to that normal, which is extremely low. So on the left-hand side, you see the rate, that's actually what they're saving. On the left-hand side, you actually see what is it that's in their pocket, so to speak. And you can see they're back at very, very low levels. All the COVID money, if you have it, is gone. And so this is a real challenge. How is the consumer going to navigate 2025 if they're worried about their job, they have a lot of debt on the books, and they don't have a lot of savings left like they had 2 or 3 years ago to spend? You have to be a little concerned about that. So the consumer, to me, is one of the question marks and one of a little bit of the very fuzzy or foggy outlook when you look at the macroeconomy. So in the last 10 minutes, let's talk a little bit quickly about grains and oilseeds and talk about what's happening around the globe. Some of this you've seen before, and I'll go through this very quickly, but when you think about what's happening with grains, stocks are good. We have lots of stuff in the world. There's no problems as far as finding stuff in the world. It's there. But you look at that black line, the stocks-to-use ratio continues to decline year after year after year. And I will say also, if you look at USDA WASDE, and I should disclose, this all changes tomorrow when WASDE comes out. But the fact is, USDA over the last several months, you've seen both domestically and globally taking stocks down, particularly cheap, it's low prices cure low prices, and we're seeing that on the demand side. These are China stocks. Don't necessarily focus on the number because these are probably not right, and China and USDA will admit to that. And China, of course, this is a state secret. But the fact is, look at how high they are to where they have been in the past. And remember what I said earlier, China is prepared this time if tariffs and supply chains get clogged up or they have trouble getting stuff. They've got reserves in place. Here's a global stocks-to-use ratio for everybody. So this is total global. And you can see that the only one that looks on the upside is soybeans. And that's not a surprise because Brazil's going to produce another huge crop going forward. So stocks-to-use ratio for corn, for wheat, and even rice is coming down off highs. And that's where markets start to get concerned, and you see a lot of volatility in markets. And we expect as we go into 25, because of all the things we've just talked about, particularly on the geopolitical side and policy side, they're going to see a lot more volatility within a fairly narrow range of prices. So we look at the exporters, and I've showed this to you before, soybeans being the exception and rice now being the exception, but there's a lot of things changing in rice, and that's a whole other discussion. But you can see with corn and wheat, you see stocks among the exporters continue to come down, and if you look around the world, the exporters have less of that total stocks number. It's just a lot smaller. And here is the stocks-to-use ratio for the exporters. And you can see that those have been relative, and think about what the whole world looked like versus what the exporters look like. They're at relatively low numbers. The good news is they've been at that for a long time, and we've survived. The bad news is they're at those low levels, and if you have some sort of supply issue or you have some sort of demand shock, that stocks-to-use ratio can change and go much lower very, very quickly because of the very low stocks at the exporters, particularly for corn and soybeans, corn and wheat. I want to talk just for a minute about demand. So one of the things that people talk about is demand, particularly 2 years ago, one of the reasons we had this big downdraft was demand was soft. Well, the problem was, remember what I said at the front, it's about supply, it's not about demand. I went back to 1960-61 and looked at global demand for grains and oilseeds over that, 50 years? No, 60 years. Getting old and can't do the math in my head anymore. There was 5 times in that time period that you saw a decrease in demand year over year. The biggest in 74-75 was 3.7%. That was the Great Russian Grain Robbery year. But for the last four that you see on this graph, it's been less than 1%. So demand is continuing to go up. And that's good news for agriculture. There is still demand in the world for people to eat. And as we improve economies around the world and we grow the economic pie and people have more money in their pocket, they will continue to buy food and buy better food. And that's good for all of you. It's good for all of us in agriculture. So I just want to talk about that and say we have, and that's one of the reasons you'll see prices, while they are at depressed levels relative to where we have been, prices are not going to fall through the floor unless something really dramatic happens, because you have this huge foundation of domestic demand that has to be fed on a day-to-day basis. Here's the U.S. grains demand, and you can see that demand globally, or here in the U.S., is good, continues to go up, but you can see exports have been, and my question, has we reached a ceiling? Because we're not competitive in the world, and what do we have to be? We have to do something to make ourselves more competitive, whether it's to reduce the cost or whether it's to be more efficient at moving that grain to other parts of the world, or moving goods and products to other parts of the world. And you can see we've been a little bit on the depressed side. And you can see too, when you look at the U.S., so this is global exports of corn, wheat, and soybeans. The black, or the top line that you see, is our share, which has gone from 60-70% to now 22%. And you can see the very dark line at the very bottom is the actual volume. For the most part, it's been relatively flat. And that's not going to change anytime soon when we have competitors like Brazil, Russia, who are willing to sell prices or sell commodities at very, very low prices that we can't compete at. Here is our U.S. exports for corn, wheat, and soybeans. You can see that we have wheat relatively flat. We do see corn going up, and we have had a very good year for corn exports in the United States. You can see soybeans come up a little bit, then flatten out. And that's primarily because of the huge domestic demand we have from the crush industry and, of course, from the biofuels industry. And then when we look at stocks overall in the U.S., you can see what's happening is that corn's up, soybeans is up a little bit, and wheat's basically flat. So I'm going to stop there and just kind of talk briefly about kind of what's happening around, and I'm going to focus basically on wheat and a couple other things that are rotational crops on the potato side. So one of the discussions we always get, or the questions we always, I have to say this is what the lawyers tell us to say, that the lawyers are telling you that I'm an idiot, so you just have to disclose that. So let's talk about wheat for a little bit and talk about what's happening with wheat, because the question we get about wheat is, well, why are wheat, you just told me that all the fundamentals for wheat are good, other than Russia continues to support more, although Russia could have some issues this year, both with the crop size and export embargoes. So why aren't wheat prices higher? And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is corn, because corn prices come down, and so you have that feed component, where if you have cheap corn prices, wheat has to work into that feed market, and it'll be cheap. The other issue is when you start, and I have these graphs in here, and they'll be, if you want them, I can get them to you. But the other problem is when you think about wheat, and an old trader told me years ago, and this will illustrate these graphs, there's someone in the world every single day harvesting wheat. When you look at the concentration of wheat production and the concentration of exporters, there's 10 countries that represent anything from 60 to 90, 80% of the world's production of wheat and exporters. So you have a lot of people who can do that. When you compare that to corn and soybeans, it's a much different story. You have 2 or 3 countries who dominate production and dominate the export market. So those markets react quicker if those countries have problems. And those countries are basically the United States and Brazil. And so that's one of the reasons why wheat just hasn't had the upsurge. When you look at the fundamentals, it's frustrating as an analyst. You look at the fundamentals and go, yeah, this is pricing go up, and then you go, but they're not. And so that's one of the issues with wheat. We talk about barley for a minute. One of the things in barley, and it basically goes back to malting barley, if you look at the volume of beer, it continues to decline. And so if you're not selling beer, and if you talk to any of the beer companies, they're not buying malting barley either. So that's one of the reasons you're seeing the barley market be a little bit cranky and not as nice as you'd like it to see, because the beer volume's not there. That whole space, and I'm not a beverage analyst on that side, but that whole space has gotten so crowded, and you see craft brewers going out as well, and so that's changing that market as well. And then finally on the hay side, because we've had some questions on hay internally in the bank, because we have some customers who are exporters of hay and are sellers of hay. And it's interesting, you've seen hay prices come down, and that's certainly a reaction to the feed market, but it's also a reaction to the export side. The Chinese have basically cut export or imports in the United States about in half. And it's pretty dramatic. And so that's why you've seen the hay market maybe be a lot weaker than what you would consider, considering sort of the weather situation we've had. But the fact is that you have so much feed available in the market, whether it's wheat, because you've seen U.S. wheat stocks come up, corn stocks have come up, and so you have the availability of substitution on the wheat side. When we think about what's happening, and I'll just finish up here sort of on the corn, wheat, and soybean side when we think about prices. We think the corn has the most upside, partly because of what's happening as far as the stocks-to-use ratio globally, and the fact is that Brazil is probably not going to, they're going to produce a crop this year, that's not the issue, but we're not going to see an increase in crop. And so that's not going to fulfill that demand that we're seeing for corn globally that's been very, very good. So that's going to keep stocks a little bit low or keep that stocks-to-use ratio under control. Wheat then will benefit from that, and wheat will bring corn, will follow corn up a little bit because that's just the way it works. And soybeans are the one that'll be the weakest. So oilseeds will be weak because you're going to have so many soybeans. You know, the Brazilians are predicted right now, we're at officially 167 million metric tons. That would be an all-time record. There are people now closer to 170, and there's even some people at 180 million metric tons of soybeans in Brazil, which is just phenomenal, unbelievable. And so the soybeans or the oilseed complex is likely to be the weakest because of uncertainty around biofuels, but also the fact that Brazil is going to have a big thing. And one thing as I finish here on this, on biofuels, one thing I will tell you just as also on a regulatory standpoint, people talk about RVO and the RFS. One of the things that you're going to see is that with the LCFS, those are state laws. And so states are demanding we have to reduce carbon emissions. And so with that, that's different than the federal law. So the federal could go on and do their own thing, but the states are going to require that, and so there's still going to be a demand from the biofuel sector to do that. So keep in that mind as that dynamic is changing, where we've been so focused for so many years on the RFS and RVO, but now you've got this other player, the LCFS, which is playing the biofuel sector, which is going to be supportive. So keep that in mind as well. So I will stop there. Thank you very much for your time. Have a great convention and have a great and profitable 2025.